morning or good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the Working with Victims in DNA Cold Hit Cases webinar presented by the National Center for Victims of Crime. My name is Zachary Draper. I am with the NCJ-FCJ, and I'm going to give you a brief tutorial on how to use the Adobe Connect system this morning. First, if you would like to give visual feedback to our presenters as they're speaking today, at the top of the screen, you will find a button resembling a person holding up their hand. To the right of that button is a drop-down arrow. By clicking this arrow, you can see a list of options for providing visual feedback. From here, you can ask the presenter to speak more loudly or softly, faster or slower, or simply indicate that you agree or disagree with a particular point or topic. When you select one of these options, an icon will appear next to your name in the attendees pod, which the presenter can see. From this menu, you can also clear your status by selecting the Clear Status option at the bottom of the list. If you would, please give this a try by raising your hand at this time and let me know that you are able to use this feature. Perfect, thank you. At the bottom of the screen is a chat pod where many of you have already been speaking. Within this window, you will be able to send messages to other participants in the webinar. Chat entered in the Everyone tab will be recorded and will be posted online as part of the recording of this meeting. To send a chat message, simply type text into the white field at the bottom of the window and press Enter on your keyboard or click the button to the right to send it. You also have the option of chatting privately with an individual in the webinar. To do so, find the individual you wish to contact in the attendees pod at the top right, mouse over their name, and select Start Private Chat from the pop-up menu. This will open a new tab at the bottom of the chat pod, which will contain your private conversation. You can quickly move between chat tabs as you desire simply by clicking on them. Chat windows with a new message in them will cause the tab to glow orange. Lastly, the Q&A pod at the bottom right is where you will be able to ask questions of the presenters in this webinar. If you have a question, simply type it in at the bottom of the Q&A pod and press Enter or press the button to the right of that chat line. The presenters will see this question and will answer them time permitting. At this time, I'd like to turn the webinar over to Ilsa Knight from the National Center of Victims for Victims of Crime. Ilsa, if you're speaking, we can't hear you.
Oh, can you hear me now?
Perfect, thank you.
Oh, okay. I had unmuted myself and then it got remuted. Sorry about that. Okay, well, welcome everyone, and I just wanted to say, Zachary, don't worry about what you did to our name because it happens quite a bit. But I'm Ilsa Connect. I'm with the National Center for Victims of Crime. I'm the Deputy Director of Public Policy at the National Center, and I also am a manager of our DNA Resource Center, which is an online resource center, but as well we do in-person trainings and webinars such as this one. We provide technical assistance and training to professionals that work with victims of crime on all kinds of issues related to the use of forensic DNA in the criminal justice system. Today we'll hear from a law enforcement professional and a victim advocate who work as a team with sexual assault survivors in cold hit DNA cases. They are going to share lessons learned with you about collaboration and using specific strategies and how those can help lessen the negative impact on victims of reopening these cases years and sometimes even decades later. We know that this is an issue that many jurisdictions are grappling with, and we are very thankful to have been awarded an Office on Violence Against Women grant that allows us to provide training and technical assistance that helps communities create a victim-sensitive response and approach to working with survivors in these untested sexual assault kit cases. I want to just give a real quick overview of the National Center for Victims of Crime. Our mission is to forge a national commitment to help victims of crime rebuild their lives, and we do this by providing training and technical assistance to victims serving and allied professionals about how they can work with victims of crime. We provide trainings and conferences, and hopefully many of you are joining us in the great city of New Orleans next week for our national conference. We also house the National Stalking Resource Center, the Youth Initiative, and the Crime Victim Bar Association. We also work on Capitol Hill and in state legislatures to bring rights and resources to programs and to victims of crime. Information about all of these programs and all of our work is on our new website at victimsofcrime.org. I want to just talk for just a second about the OVW grant that we have. This is the project goal to ensure that communities have the tools to create a victim-sensitive approach to sexual assault kit backlog reduction. We are doing webinars. We'll do 12 webinars over the next 2 years, such as these. Many of our topics are listed here. We're going to be doing one in October on trauma response and the impact of trauma on victim participation. And then hopefully in November or December, we'll be doing something on culturally informed responses to victims in these cases. And you can see the other list there. And if you want to join or get more information about these webinars, you can email me, and I will put you on our list to get the announcements for these webinars. We are creating an online resource library. We're collecting all sorts of resources, sample policies and protocols on victim notification. We're looking at victims' rights that might apply in these cases where a sexual assault kit has been backlogged, and related legislation, such as mandatory turnaround times for sexual assault kits and John Doe warrants, extending the statute of limitations, etc. We will be providing technical assistance by phone, email, or other contacts in person as well. We'll provide consultation to select communities if you are addressing your untested kit problem and you have specific questions about working with victims in those cases. You can feel free to email me, and we will work with you to get you the information you need. Real quickly, on February 16th, we held a victim roundtable, and we will be doing interviews with survivors. And we asked these survivors about what their needs are in these cases, and we asked them to discuss what worked for them and what didn't and what could have been done better. We talked to them about notification. We heard from them about their right to be heard and what justice meant to them. So we have prepared a report, and that will be on our website in the next few weeks. Covered that already. A lot of this is information that our presenters are going to talk with you about today, but one of the things we're really looking at with our project is this notification issue. Who should be doing it, how they should be doing it, and when. And Cindy and Rick are going to talk a lot about that from their perspective. Here's my email. If you have policies and protocols on victim notification in cold cases, I'd love to see them. A lot of people are doing this work, but they haven't written it down. So if you do have something on paper, that would be great. If you can send it to me, I'd really appreciate that. More of my contact information is here. So today, we are very pleased to have with us Cindy Malott and Detective Rick Noble. Cindy is the Crisis Intervention Supervisor at the YWCA St. Louis Regional Sexual Assault Center. She supervises the Y's hospital and police advocacy programs. She has worked with sexual assault survivors for 19 years, so she definitely has some expertise to share with us today. Detective Rick Noble has been a police officer with the St. Louis Metropolitan Police Department for 15 years. He has been a detective in the Sex Crimes Unit for over 9 years with considerable focus on cold hit DNA cases. And I have learned a lot from both of them already, just from our conversations over the course of preparing for this webinar, and I am sure that you will learn a lot too. So I want to welcome Cindy and Rick.
Thank you.
Thank you. We can get our PowerPoint up there on the screen. I want to thank everybody for listening in on us today. Cindy and I have been working together for a long time and do several presentations together, and one of it is dealing with the victims of the cold hit. If there's something that you don't understand or something that I've skipped over, please send us the message. You can put it in the chat or the Q&A. I'd like to try and hold all the questions till the end. We hope that we answer most of them. But if you send them in the Q&A there, we'll try and see where we can work in the answer without taking away from the presentation as a whole. So the goals of the presentation are to increase the ability of law enforcement, healthcare professionals to provide the most effective response to sexual assault victims, and increasing some of the dynamics of sexual assault. The dynamics of sexual assault will be a 4-hour conference, and we don't have the time for that today. We hope most of you are aware that these victims are different, and in dealing with them, we can't use the same tools that law enforcement or advocacy used for other crimes because they're kind of unique. And what we really want to work on today is how law enforcement and advocacy can get together to help rape victims on these cold hit DNA cases, the CODIS cases as we call them here.
My name's Cindy Malott. Again, I'm with the YWCA St. Louis Regional Sexual Assault Center. Rick and I together have worked, and this is he working directly with the victim, and I also working directly with the victim with over 500 victims. We've worked together for about 10 years. So a lot of the conversations we have about this is what we commonly see. There's thousands, literally at this point, I think I've worked with thousands of victims. I know I have. And Rick has worked for years and years with multiple sexual assault victims as well. But when we're giving case studies and talking about examples of cold hit DNA cases and victims we work with in those cases, we've worked together with, I think, quite a few over the years, and 500 or more sexual assault victims together.
So just a little bit of terminology that we're going to talk. A cold case is just a term that we're going to use to describe an older unsolved case or unresolved if there were issues with it, no warrants were issued. It doesn't necessarily have to be a CODIS case with a DNA hit, but just a case that law enforcement is working after some lapse in time. And the reason why those are unique is the victim may have moved on to somewhere else in their life. It's not that you still have this working relationship with them. So a lot of times you're doing reaching out to them after some delay. Cases where all the leads have been investigated, there may not have been any suspects identified. We've recently seen DNA cases where a suspect was identified but no warrant was issued. And now we're going back on those cases also to try and bring some justice to them. So just a brief overview for those that are not in the law enforcement, which I assume we have a lot of those out there. The CODIS system is the Combined DNA Indexing System, and it's national, state, and local databases. The FBI is the overall manager of those, and as it fingers out to the state and then the local level, there's various CODIS administrators that work the DNA from the FBI level down to local law enforcement.
When we're talking about who our victims are, something that Rick and I try to be aware of when we're working, recontacting victims years later, sometimes decades later with a cold DNA hit, or if it's a cold case that we're recontacting them for some reason, is keeping in mind or being aware that the people that we're contacting may have varied histories. May have a history of substance abuse, history of child sexual abuse. We may be recontacting them, and what happened to them was a time when maybe there was substance abuse and prostitution, and maybe their current partners or family are unaware that they were previously raped or that they had been through any issues with law enforcement in the past. So there's not just the shock of recontacting the victim, but also being aware that sometimes when we're recontacting them, of privacy as much as possible and confidentiality for the victim, so that we're not disclosing past events in their lives, and the rape, sexual assault, but then also other things that were going on in their lives and other challenges they had to family and friends when we're trying to reach the people or contact them or recontact them. You may have very little information about the person that you're contacting, emotional stability at that point. One example that I use is with a victim that we were working with who was recontacted. She was raped by strangers in her home when she was 16 years old. It's actually her birthday. She was contacted 10 years later when there was a cold DNA hit on the case. And one of the things when I'm talking with her, I ended up working with her for about 3 years. It took a while because her perpetrators had to go through juvenile court as well and be certified as adults. So it was a kind of an ongoing process for about 3 years. At one point, I was talking with her, and she said, Cindy, I wonder, I keep asking, and she was very religious. I kept asking God, why did it have to take 10 years? Why that long? Why didn't this happen 5 years ago or 4 or 6 years ago or right after the rape or sexual assault? And she kind of was working through that through the time I was working with her. And at some point toward the end of the process, when there had been, I believe, a plea was taken on the case by both perpetrators, she said, you know, I've prayed about this a lot. I've thought about this a lot. And she said, at the time, if I had been contacted 5 years ago, she said, Cindy, at that time, I wasn't the woman I am now. I wasn't in college. I wasn't working full time. I was using drugs. I was very depressed. I was going through a very bad period in my life. She said ever since the rape, when she was 16, she'd kept a gun in her nightstand. She said, Cindy, I honestly feel if the detective would have contacted me during that time and told me there'd been a hit on the case, having that brought back up for me, having the emotional impact of that, she said, I think I would have had a nice conversation with him on the phone, then I probably went back to my room and shot myself in the head. And this is not a woman, I've worked with her for a long time, that's very dramatic when she describes things. She's very low-key, very calm. I think that's something that we have to be aware. We don't know what period someone is in their life when we're recontacting them and bringing up what hopefully is one of the worst things that ever happened to them and asking them to some extent to relive that.
And yeah, that victim. I can't let it go without the funny part to that story, because Cindy's smiling at me now. When my partner and I went to interview one of the suspects in prison, we sat down with him and we simply said, "Hey, we'd like to talk to you about this rape." And he says, "I didn't do it," and he went through his whole spiel about how I couldn't have done it. And then we told him, you know what, hey, there's a DNA match in this case, and you might want to reconsider that. And his response was that he would never climb in a window and rape anyone. The funny part was we have the recorded interview. We had never mentioned anything to him about the suspect climbing through the window. So it was almost the point at which my partner and I smiled to each other and said, yeah, we think we're going to be able to get a conviction on this one. So
I have to admit I enjoy hearing stories like that when Rick decides to share them with me. I really do enjoy it.
So back to the DNA, we have, for those of you out there that are in smaller departments or in county sheriffs, you may not have the luxury that I have with a local DNA lab that is affiliated with my department that handles nothing but DNA requests from my department. So we have our local DNA system, and then in Missouri we have the state DNA system, which is run by the Missouri State Highway Patrol, and in your state I would assume the state law enforcement agency, and then the national system by the FBI. There are all different types of criteria for what samples can be loaded into each one, and that would be an 8-hour class, if not a 3-day class, to figure that out. Just let it be known out there that there are these samples floating around of the suspects and the these unknowns from these rape cases, and the system is currently working every day to try and pair up and make matches on those. So when we receive a hit, and mostly I'm speaking for what is in my department here in St. Louis, but I think most places are the same way, we're either going to get a hit which tells us who an offender is, or we're going to get a forensic hit which says this rape is linked to this other rape, or this other burglary, or this other case like that. And when we get that, first thing you have to do is go back and read those original reports and figure out what we can do on this case now. So this is where we'll try and start a little collaboration with Cindy, where I have to find out where my victim is. And in order to do that, I'm going to have to try and reach her by telephone, by mail, in person. I couldn't tell you what I like best. Telephone, obviously, is the easiest from an investigator standpoint, but it doesn't allow me to make any assessment on the victim's emotional impact, what her reactions are when I bring up this case, and it kind of leaves her out there hanging. We've tried to do a lot of in-person things with Cindy and I going out together. Sometimes I try and do it alone, and I get reminded from Cindy that that's not the right way, and she's right. For all my police out there, she's absolutely right.
Well, I'm going to use an example for this, and Rick and I have talked about this, and we actually work together as much as we can, as in-depthly as we can, to provide the best services for victims. But a few years ago, Rick contacted me. They basically, the police have a phone number where they can reach our advocacy center, which is myself or one of the other staff 24 hours a day. So Rick calls me, and I don't think he realizes that maybe I have a life, but he called me at like 6 in the morning or something like that, or 7 in the morning, and I've got my little girl in the bath, and I'm giving her a bath, and he gets on the phone, and when Rick's done something that he knows I'm going to be upset about, he talks extraordinarily fast so that I can't catch what he did. And he's like, Cindy, we have to get you need to get in the car. We need to meet with this woman. We need to get her some help. You need to get in the car. When can I meet you? And he's just talking a mile a minute. So pretty much I ended up trying to get the kids off to school and met with him right away. And we go to this woman's house. And I'm going to let him give you a little bit of the backstory, and then I'll kind of catch up to speed as what happened then.
We back in the mid-'90s, we had a series of rapes in St. Louis City that we thought were all related, and we started taking in samples from all over the metropolitan area and saying, hey, send us any DNA samples you have. We can get the request done fast and this and that. So we ended up with a lot of samples that we didn't know exactly why we had them or where they came from, and this was a hit. It was a hit for an unsolved rape, and so I didn't know where exactly it occurred, so I had to physically go find the victim and ask her, we have your DNA stuff here, but we're not real sure where you were actually raped. And it turned out she wasn't raped in the city. It was in several counties away. And so when I met with her, I simply said, hey, I'll have an investigator from that department give you a call, and he'll be reaching out to you. And I did that. However, what happened to her on that night was one of those epiphany moments for me that made the emotional impact of the police just bringing up a rape from years earlier. It showed to me and anyone else that I can talk to about this case that it's not an easy thing for the victim to deal with. And what happened that next morning when I came into work was about 35 messages from that victim telling me that she was fine until I came in contact with her. And I had a 30-second conversation with her at her door. That was it. But that she had put this behind her until I came in, and that I had done this to her, and she was fine. And that was repeated in 30-plus messages on the phone, which then prompted me to drag Cindy to her house.
So we arrive at this poor woman's house the next day, probably about 9 a.m. in the morning, somewhere along that line. And Rick meets me, and he has his intern with him, the college intern, kind of a tall, gangly kid that follows Rick around. Who kind of follows Rick around and tries to basically, sorry, we were having a technical issue there, who kind of follows Rick around and basically wants to be Rick. And so they show up at the door. We knock and knock on this poor woman's door. She's not answering. We can hear a little dog barking out in the inside. And Rick's panicking for a very good reason. We're both concerned that maybe she did something, maybe hurt herself or harmed herself in some way. So we beat on the door. Rick says, I'm going to go get the manager to open this door, to unlock this door if she doesn't answer. And we're all very concerned. Finally, this poor woman opens the door. She is in her makeup still on her face, obviously just woke up. Looks like she's had a pretty rough night. And she's looking at the three of us standing on her porch like, what is wrong with you people? What are you doing here? Why are y'all standing on my doorstep? Rick literally opens the door, barely explains who I am. He just pushes me in the door with literally his hand on my back, pushing me in the door, saying, ma'am, you really need to talk to Cindy. Cindy's here to talk to you. Is it okay if she comes in and talks with you? And this woman's like, well, okay. And she's holding her poor little chihuahua who's barking, and she looks at Rick and says, okay, but you're going to have to take my little dog, Bobby, outside and kind of let him take care of his business. So in the end, the woman was fine. She'd had quite a bit to drink. I got to spend about an hour sitting and talking with her in her lovely, very beautiful little condominium, and I got to watch out the back French doors, the glass doors, as Rick and his the intern who was with him, who also dresses like Rick and wears cool cop sunglasses just like Rick, and I think he'd like to have a radio and a gun like Rick. So they're standing out there in the heat walking Buddy with his little rhinestone collar around for about a good 45 minutes while Buddy kind of takes care of business. So it ended up well. The woman was fine. She's doing well. Actually, she's doing very well. I talked with her recently, and it's been a few years. But I think that's kind of that. What we really try to tell that story and utilize that for is sometimes that you may have that 30-second conversation as an officer with that victim, and she may seem fine. I hear that all the time. Well, she seemed fine. She seemed okay. But then what we're finding out is people are still in shock. It's after you leave, after you walk out the door, you don't know what place that person is in. You don't know if that's that young woman who I talked about earlier who's going to go and get a gun out and contemplate suicide, or if it's going to be someone like this lady who handled it the best way she knew how, and she was very clear about it, was by drinking about a case of beer, basically, and making lots of phone calls through the middle of the night. So it kind of taught both of us a lesson that we try to make sure we make every effort to work together from the very initial contact at the
Yeah, so that at the bottom of our PowerPoint there, you'll see a line that says that there's an increase in requests from the crime lab for consensual partner DNA samples. Okay. For the advocates out there, if we have the nurses, and the police are already well aware of this, that the FBI has tightened up some of their guidelines a little bit on what they'll allow in their database, and they really only want the unknown suspect samples. So now that we are working these old cases from the 90s, and my department is back to 1986 at this point, we are getting requests from the lab to contact the victim and ask who were their consensual partners and to get samples from those before we can upload that DNA into the database. This has created a whole new thing because when Cindy and I go out to talk to a person and we say, we know who your suspect is, that is one set of reactions. However, when you go out and the only news that I can tell them after 20 years is that I need to know who their consensual partners are, it's created quite a conversation for Cindy and I how we do that and not provide them with anything to go on at that point. We've had to be very creative in that.
And it's very difficult. Sometimes the only thing that Rick's able to offer is not any type of criminal justice in this matter or closure for the victim. It may be connecting them with some. It's not uncommon. A couple of people we've recently contacted, these are now elderly women, and they will tell you they never talked to a counselor. They never talked to anyone. It was something they felt like because of the time period and the lack of services at that time, that they really had to handle it themselves. I think one woman said a direct quote to Rick, which kind of stuck with me.
She leaned over to me, and she was a 75-year-old woman who was sexually assaulted in '86, and said, "Sweetie, in those days, us women knew that we had to handle this thing on our own." And I didn't even know how to respond to her other than to let her know that she's paved the way for things to become much better. And I think we still have some room to go forward some more, but we're not at the point with dropping a victim off at the hospital and that's it. I think we're beyond that, and I hope everybody listening to this knows that we're beyond that.
And we talked about a lot of things that are listed in this slide before, but the only thing I really want to readdress is, again, that kind of fear of law enforcement. And that may be not necessarily fear of law enforcement itself, but the situation Rick's describing. With these a couple of ladies that we've contacted recently, to describe just the negative, the whole ordeal to them was negative, being taken to the hospital, left at the hospital, didn't have anyone there with them, no advocate, no one to sit with them, leaving, having to take a bus home in a hospital gown because they didn't have clothing. I mean, when you're not only bringing back up a rape or a sexual assault, or again, hopefully one of the worst things that's happened to this person, but also for a lot of victims that we're recontacting, they feel like they were not only raped or sexually assaulted, but re-victimized by the process. And sometimes that has to do with law enforcement, sometimes hospital response, sometimes their emotional response or family response, and sometimes a combination of all three. We had recently one lady that we recontacted after, gosh, I think it was nearly 20 years, and she was really, this is a way that Rick and I guess, team up to try to be as effective as possible. She was Rick had spoken with her over the phone, but she was very, very reluctant to come in and meet with him or to agree to meet with him at all. And so what he ended up doing was putting her and I in contact over the phone, and then I was able to talk with her as a community agency, not from a law enforcement agency, and work things through and kind of talk about her emotional reactions. At some point, she disclosed to me that her real fear of meeting with the detective, she was anxious to find out more details about what had happened or be collaborative with the law enforcement to go forward with the case. She was being told by her family members and friends that, don't go, you know, you have outstanding traffic tickets in some municipality. This is all a sting to get you. Don't do it. Don't go. Don't trust them. So sometimes just fear of law enforcement in general is a way that we can work together to kind of, obviously that was not the issue. There was no sting, but that was something that she seriously was afraid of, and she didn't feel comfortable disclosing to the detective. So we were able to work through that and meet with her and move forward, and actually the case went to trial, and he was sentenced recently.
And I wanted to just make clear before we continue that when we're, some of these stories that we've talked about are definitely on the older side. These are not things that we're seeing currently in the people that we're dealing with, that the strides have been made. But I just want to make sure nobody assumes that we're talking to a victim from a month ago that says that they didn't have these services.
No, we have comprehensive services and a comprehensive partnership at this point. But it's very, very different. When we're talking about these cases from long ago, we're talking about cases that were oftentimes 20, 30 years old. Not at all uncommon. So anyway, what can be helpful is just, again, being aware of the victim's privacy. Avoid cold calling them if possible. I realize sometimes the investigators just don't have a choice, and there's nothing else that they can do. Connect the victim immediately if possible. Whenever there's a situation where Rick and I aren't able to go out and meet with the victim in person, we oftentimes will he'll connect me with them, or we'll get connected over the phone as soon as possible. Obviously, the preference on my behalf is to meet face-to-face with that person, but just sometimes because of trying to locate a victim and spending all day going from place to place to place, it just isn't an option. So we still find backup ways to try to work together to be as effective as possible and connect the victim, the advocate, as soon as possible. And again, an intense emotional reaction, and we were already given a couple of examples of this, are very common. So one of the ways that we collaborate, that we respond collaboratively is we provide a 24-hour response. If I'm contacted by anyone, and Rick is from the St. Louis Metropolitan Police Department, anytime we're contacted by an officer, we provide a 24-hour response. If that's an immediate situation to the hospital, and if it's a delayed report, if it's someone coming into the police station and it isn't necessary for them to go to the hospital, maybe reporting child sexual abuse from years previously, or again, if it's recontacting a cold DNA hit victim, we will respond 24 hours a day. And I think that if we expect that phone call 24 hours a day, we need to be able to respond that way as well. And that provides that holistic approach and that team approach, and we generally call it the collaborative approach of connecting that person with all their needs immediately. And we involve also health care in that if it's a recent rape or sexual assault.
So sometimes there is a delay in solving these cases, and what my recommendation is to the law enforcement out there is that you re-interview that victim. And the reason why I say that is some of these original reports may be great, but there are some modern understandings of sexual assault investigations now that I think all of our investigators should have. And if they don't, there are classes out there to tell you on those dynamics of sexual assault. And I don't know this to be a fact, but I'm guessing in 1985, they weren't teaching the class the dynamics of sexual assault. They might not have even been teaching in 1995. But today the classes are out there. So you need to be aware of that. And sometimes you may have to correct some errors made in the past, wherein there might have been some blame on the victim. There might have been those questions about clothing and different things that were completely irrelevant and took the investigation sideways. And we can fix those now. We can explain why a victim reacted the way they did. So, and also it's a way for the investigator in 2012 to fully understand the intricacies of the case. If you're going out with a DNA hit to interview a suspect and you haven't spoken to that victim yourself and done an interview with her, I think that you may be doing a disservice to yourself and to the investigation. Because what we know about sexual assault victims is that they remember things in pieces. And it takes them a while to put the pieces of the puzzle together. And if you're interviewing someone 20 years later, they may be able to paint that whole picture to you that night back in 1990, they weren't able to do because of trauma, because of shock, because of all kinds of other things that they were worried about at the time that now they're not worried about. So that is there. Go ahead.
The emotional impact on victims, again, is as Rick stated, some people, it's just something that they remember every detail. They played it over and over and over again. They probably tried not to remember those details, and they're just stuck emotionally. For a lot of victims, though, I would say it's almost equally as common, if not more so common, that they're terrified because they don't remember every detail. Everything emotionally, physiologically in them has tried to forget these details in order to really move on, to focus, to function in their life, to raise their kids, to continue working, to do whatever they ended up having, throughout their life, deal with other traumas. They've had to kind of compartmentalize this and tried to forget it. At some point, most of them have come to the acceptance after a year, 2 years, if not sooner, this person's never going to be caught. For these people that we're contacting 20, 30 years later, the very concept that DNA might at some point be found to connect the sexual assault that happened to them to a specific perpetrator is beyond what they think is a reasonable expectation. It would never occur to them that that's even possible. They're completely shocked just that would happen. Their assumptions often, well, if that was going to happen, why didn't that happen 25 years ago or 20 years ago, or when people first started talking about DNA on television, that sort of thing, when crime shows started talking about the use of DNA. So there's a real confusion or shock value. Go ahead.
Right, but Cindy, what we found, and what I want to stress to everybody is, when we've created this environment that was comfortable and was something that we eliminated some of the fears of the institutional system of sexual assault, we have met with some amazing women who, years later, you would not think that they remembered all of these things, and they do. And they're just, a lot of times, very happy that someone is sitting down in a comfortable environment, not the curbside interview, not on their sofa, not outside of a motel room, where we bring them down to the office, to the victim interview room, with windows, and it's open and
pictures
airy.
on the wall.
And an advocate is there. And we have sat down with women who, and even young girls who are 15, who can still tell you what clothes they were wearing that the police took, after 15 years. And it's amazing what you can learn when you create the environment to bring them into that fold, what happens.
Yeah, and sometimes the fear is not so much that they don't remember the important details, it's their fear of not remembering every single detail. So as Rick stated, the more comfortable we can make them, again, another reason for this collaborative response, to make that person feel as comfortable as possible, is the point is going to be more effective. It's more effective for the investigation. It's more effective for the victims. A lot of times victims have really never had anyone to talk to them or explain this to them. And a lot of victims to just be told that that's normal, everything they're feeling. Sometimes they're very ashamed that they're not excited about the perpetrator being caught, or there's a mix of feelings. Part of them there's a sense of dread or fear. And some victims are very ashamed of whatever emotional response they had at that time, at the time of the rape or sexual assault, and just for someone to sit down with them, and that's something that Rick will try to do, but I can also explain to them in a little bit different terms, that their response, which for most victims we see, I won't say all, we do have obviously a lot of victims that have fought or tried to escape the situation, but I would say Rick and I would be in total agreement that the vast majority of victims we work with, their response to the rape or sexual assault was at some point, they might have immediately tried to get away or tried to avoid the situation, but when they realized at some point that that wasn't going to be an option for them, either earlier on or later on in the rape, they at some point, it's very, very common for them to freeze. And a more clinical term for that is tonic immobility. And we talk about this, Rick and I, at every presentation that we do because it is the norm. It was the norm 30 years ago. It's a normal, and I'm not going to read off the slide to you, but you can read the quotes that are listed there. You see one of them is listed from 1979. This is not something new. It's something that's happened 30 years ago to victims we're recontacting, and it happens today. That is the most common response. If you watch a lot of victims, all they have to go on is television shows or crime shows where people fight to the death, or they're covered in bruises or covered in cuts and shot and everything imaginable. The most common response is to freeze, and that's something when a victim gets to hear that or realize that, I think that it's, for a lot of the victims we're working with, it's something they've needed maybe, particularly with cold hit cases, they've needed to hear for 10, 15 years. Something that I say, and I hear Rick say, or he actually once in a while he'll admit that I say something and he'll repeat it that he actually agrees with, is that whatever decision you made to the victim was the right decision because you're safe, you're alive now, you've gotten through the situation, you're with us here now. So whatever decisions you made, if you froze, if you fought, whatever it was, you did the right thing because you kept yourself alive and got through that situation.
Let it be known I came up with that and Cindy stole it from me.
That's a bald-faced lie.
So a couple of things that we think can be helpful. We want to arrange to meet the victim in person, even if a full interview is not necessary. For the victim to be able to put a face with the name of the person that they're talking to that's going to take that next step in their case is huge. That personal connection there is going to bring them around, try and eliminate some of that bad stuff that may happen years ago. And what we want to say is have the victim advocate present with you when you meet the victim. Now, I know I may have 25 policemen on this line. They're saying, Rick, I can't do that. And I'm going to say, you're probably right. If you're going out to the house and cold calling because you can't find an address, well, it may not be feasible to take the advocate with you. But if you are going to meet with a victim at her house to schedule something in the future, I suggest you have some pamphlets for your local advocacy center there, or you get permission to have the advocate call them. Because I can't tell you the number of times I've left a house now where if I don't have Cindy with me, it's, can I have our victim advocate give you a call this evening because she'd like, you may need someone to talk to. And the response that I always get is yes. I have yet to have someone say, no, detective, you can't have someone call me to ask me how I'm doing a little bit later on tonight. So the answer is yes. And get that permission there. Get with your advocacy agency and make sure that that protocol is set up, that that's an acceptable thing, and get these women in touch with them to where when they come down to do that interview with you in the day after that you do that. I highly recommend against doing any follow-up interviews in a victim's living room. It just isn't good. There's distractions, there's family, but to get them in a safe place with you, the advocate, and the victim where you can do that. There was a question earlier about, and I'll throw it in here, about getting a consensual partner's DNA. it isn't something that your local police agency is deciding, oh, we want to go and find out who all this victim has slept with. Now, that's how that question is perceived, because when you have to ask who else might you have been having sex with, the victim hears, they're calling me a name. We won't use bad words here, but that's what they think that you're trying to paint them. And so that's not it. But what the FBI has said, and anybody that works for an agency that has a lab there, they've heard this, that you can't just throw everything at CODIS and see what sticks. What the FBI wants you to upload to their database is the punitive perpetrator, the person who you believe is the one and only person or an unknown DNA sample that could have committed this crime. So with that being said, we have to go out and eliminate any consensual partners before the protocol allows for us to upload that sample to the national level. Now, locally, we're not required to do that, and at the state level, it's a few more restrictions. But by the time you get to that national database, the one that the FBI directly controls, there are safeguards, and they're probably there for a reason. Think of all the police departments out there that could just throw everything at it and just wait to see what hits. That's not good, and it would probably overload the database. So when you end up getting a DNA match, you're going to have to get a confirmation DNA. And this is going to be a delay for a victim. It starts an emotional journey for them because CODIS requires that they cannot be the sole source used for prosecution. So almost every prosecutor that I've ever talked to out there has said, go out and get an independent sample, have our DNA people double-check CODIS. And it's a double-check, and it's a good one, to make sure that there wasn't some mistake done. Well, that's going to take some time, and that's hard to put out for a victim.
And this is another example of why it's so important that we work together as a team and work collaboratively. This process, the confirmation DNA, can really be a form of, I don't know a better term, but purgatory for victims. You have victims who are very anxious, they want some answers, they want some closure, and now they're being told, okay, we think we might have somebody identified, but now we're going to have to do this, and it could be months before we get a confirmation of whether or not this is accurate. So that puts a victim where they really don't know. There's that fear. They expect that the DNA is going to match or be the expectation of law enforcement. They don't know that. And they have that fear, again, that this is all being brought back up, and it may be for nothing, in their opinion, and that's very, very understandable, and they have a very succinct point. Or if the DNA at times and we have had situations where it didn't match or ended up being a consensual partner, now we're basically bringing this up for the victim and letting them know that basically there's a guarantee that well, not a guarantee, but in their minds, a guarantee that now the rapist will never be caught. Maybe they held out hope. Maybe some of the cases that aren't 30 years old, but are 10, 8, 9, 10 years old, where there is this hope for DNA match. Now they're realizing only DNA other than their own found in the evidence collection kit, and that was kind of their last hope, belonged to a consensual partner. So that very, very difficult emotionally for most victims to deal with. For victims, it's important to give them a timeline of what to expect. I think that's one of those things when we recontact them that's very effective, that law enforcement and advocates can work together and make sure that they understand the confirmation DNA. When you meet with them immediately, sometimes it can be absolutely overwhelming, all the information. They're just reeling from the emotional shock. That's one of the helpful things also about teaming up with advocates, and we do this sometimes further down the road too, is a victim may hear all the things that you're saying, but she's really not taking it in. So as an advocate, when I'm there with her, one of the things I can do is continue to talk it through with her, the emotional support, but also helping her to understand the process. That's why with the advocates that are working with sexual assault victims with cold hit DNA cases, it's extraordinarily important that you become educated in the process yourself, because that's part of your job. If you can't effectively help the victim to understand the process, then you're not being an effective advocate. You have to be educated in this area, or you could potentially be more harmful than helpful. So that's a responsibility on you, and that's on the advocates. Law enforcement, our expectation in a collaborative process is to connect with the victim advocate, regardless of whether there's an identified perpetrator or not, for reasons we just talked about. And again, regardless of the situation, just your phone call, just that contact, like we talked about with the woman with the little dog, and we kind of talked about that story. Again, you can expect equally, him just knocking on the door saying someone may contact you about this, for 30-second conversation or a 30-second phone call can literally be enough to have a huge impact emotionally on victims.
So I see that in the chat box, Angela talked about how some of the victims are upset by it eases up. We agree wholeheartedly that after that initial shock of oh my God, they're bringing this all up again. We have seen some people that are very grateful and very thankful that we're still working on the case. And it does ease up a little bit.
Very excited sometimes to hear from law enforcement.
And I'll get to yours in just a little bit at the end. But now, so we're at the case, we're at the spot where we've told them that there's a DNA match, we've confirmed the DNA, and we have the victim completely on board. Cindy's on board, the police are on board, we have our case, and then we meet with the prosecutor. And for anyone in the works that deals with this, you know that that this is where things can either, I don't know if it's good or bad, if it's hot or cold, I don't know, but this is where things change a little bit. When we present that case, we can either get a warrant issued or a warrant refused. There's not much in between there. That's the time where that decision is made to either terminate the case or to move it forward. And this can be a very, for them. The main thing that we're seeing here in the state of Missouri is statute of limitations. Different states may have different statutes. My recommendation is to everybody out there, remember that if your victim may have been a juvenile, they could look for some different statutes covering that. We've seen a lot more leeway in Missouri on juvenile victims than on adults. And there's a second obstacle, and the sheer facts of the case. Not all cases can go forward. I've heard many a prosecutor meet with myself and a victim on many occasions say, we firmly believe what you're telling us, but we cannot prove this case to a jury beyond a reasonable doubt. And the DNA doesn't matter. What I'm seeing in the majority of my cases, and I think that most police would say the same thing, is the suspect is going to claim the consent offense, and DNA is then taken off the shelf completely because he's admitting that he was there, he's admitting that he had sex with her, he's just trying to say that it was consensual, and that's a whole different class to how to beat that. But so when that is used, it just wipes that DNA off, and this can be a hard time for the victim.
And again, I think Angela mentioned about how some victims are very upset at first, but it eases up definitely. And you can see victims go through up and down through the whole process. One time, if it is going forward and is going to go to trial or is going through the court process or potentially a plea, that's when you will tend to see, sorry about that, you'll tend to see some victims who will get really kind of be doing well for a while, but they really aren't able to kind of totally move through it or get forward or get through it until they've really gone through to finish the criminal justice end. And they'll tend to go up and down and get really anxious right before trial and think that would be natural for anyone. And then Kelly mentioned connecting with victims that live out of state. I still would follow up with them by phone, but what I'm obviously going to do since I can't meet them in person is to connect them, actively connect them with an advocate and with counseling services if that's something they're interested in, usually through RAIN or if there's an agency that I'm aware of, but I will definitely get them connected with services where they are located. Again, emotional impact on the victims. Regardless of the outcome of each case, it's going to be unique, varied emotional responses depending on the individual. And keep in mind also, if the case is issued, a huge concern for rape victims, whether it's a cold hit DNA case or not, is also be aware of rape shield laws and share those with victims. As advocates, that's an important thing for you to remember. Benefits of a collaborative response.
Well, we're going to talk about providing the victim with the immediate support and necessary resources, whether it's a recent crime or a cold DNA case. This applies to your new sexual assault cases and your cold ones. Immediate support and necessary resources. You want to restore the sense of dignity and support to help them recover. You might be undoing years of bad police work 20 years ago to bring this person back around. Provide important information to the victim about moving forward and making informed decisions. I am not the best social worker in the world. Sometimes I have to play that role, but when I take an advocate with me, it allows me to focus in on what I'm doing, and I have a partner there that's going to watch for those other things and be cognizant of those, because I'm not looking at that. I want to say that I am. I want to say that I'm in tune, but sometimes I'm pretty focused, especially when I sink my teeth into a suspect, and I may forget about a lot of other things that have to do with the victim. I can admit that. So.
And something that, as an advocate, my focus is not the criminal investigation. It's to assist the victim through that process. But again, the most important factor for all of us is the victim's emotional recovery. And I can focus then, like Rick says, on how they're doing on that end. I work at a rape crisis center. I'm lucky enough to have clinical therapy services and counseling services at no cost I can offer to the victim. And I can offer them case management if they need assistance with other issues that are going on in their lives, emotional support, information, help them understand the process. If you come from an agency where you're advocating but you don't have that clinical backup or the therapy services available, then you need to connect with a partner too. That's something that's absolutely necessary. And expectations for law enforcement and effective collaboration is, as usual, and I expect most do, but just remember, obviously, always treat victims with respect and dignity, even if you're touching base with someone who at that point or is currently having substance abuse issues. One thing too, or has been engaged in prostitution or other criminal activity. Some states, be aware, in Missouri, we do have confidentiality for sexual assault victim advocates, so that's something that's important as advocates and law enforcement when you're building these teams and building these partnerships to utilize and respect advocate confidentiality laws, which a lot of states have. And then again, with law enforcement, our request to you is stay connected with us. You have a lot of cases we do. If we keep in touch and are working through this together, I can better help a victim to understand where they are in the process and what to expect and give them the information. And that prevents you from having to basically do crisis intervention and things like that. That's one of the things Rick will, if he's got someone who's very hysterical or very upset or very depressed or anxious or just wants information and just needs to talk things through, he's going to get us in touch right away so that I can do those things with that victim. Again, and connecting advocacy support immediately is extremely helpful, and have an advocate present for the police interview. Under no circumstances ever are we a part of that interview. Our job is to provide emotional support to the victim. We don't clarify questions. We don't coach the victim on what to say. We don't interrupt the interview, and I think respecting those professional boundaries for advocates is extremely important if we're going to ask for this collaboration and expect it from law enforcement. And for law enforcement, just to be prepared. Any type of, I think, cross-training is extremely helpful. Be prepared to understand the emotional impact, and hopefully we're doing some of that today for victims who have been traumatized. And obviously, with the cases where the young woman was afraid to come forward, afraid to meet with the detective because of a traffic ticket sting, the more, obviously, trust that you can establish with the victims, particular victims that have had what they would describe as a very negative police response maybe 15, 20 years ago, that can be extremely important.
If you follow along on a couple of things. Elsa, we're not going to get cut off at 1 o'clock, correct? If we run a little bit long. I'd like everybody to stick around. Cindy and I will be here, so if you can give us a couple of minutes, that would be great.
Yeah, that's fine. That's fine. Keep going.
Okay. Chris and Tanya are going along in the chat, and Cindy and I are nodding our head. In a victim-centered approach, if a victim does not wish to prosecute, we can't force them, and I don't think that's a good idea. I think that when you create the environment that is open and transparent, that you'll be able to bring the victim may come around on her own. And from the police standpoint, God, I'd love to put everybody in the penitentiary. I can't do it. I wish I could, but I get everybody in touch with Cindy, and you'd be amazed the people that 6 or 8 months down the road end up telling her, okay, I think I'm ready to go forward. So there are also a bunch of questions on the side. We will get to them. We're looking at them as we go along, and we'll be round at the end. So if there are some expectations for law enforcement, there's got to be some expectations for advocates. I need a consistent response that I want from them. They need to be, I joke, but they need to be professional, prompt, on time, and provide the service that they're there to do for. And all in all, that's what I find over and over and over again. Why do we have an advocate sit in on the police interview? I get asked that when I teach this, and it seems the further I get away from my big city, the more foreign of a concept this is. But when you create an environment that is comfortable for the victim, you will get a much better statement. And if your state has confidentiality like Missouri does and a number of other states, correct, Cindy?
Yeah.
There's no harm, there's no foul in this. And whenever I hear the big thing that I always hear the conversation is, Rick, when I talk to a person, I get to the truth, and I go, okay, maybe it's time for you to go write some traffic tickets, because if that's your response, maybe you've been in your bureau too long, or you got some old things. What we need to do is provide that. When you're interviewing a suspect, absolutely, you go in there hard. But if you just stop and listen to a victim, you make her comfortable and you listen, you don't have to get to the truth because she's telling you that. She will tell you that. If you use interrogation techniques on a victim, you make them go into defense mode. And when people go into defense, they start saying things that they think you want to hear. And that's a common problem, but make it nice. But, well, we're running out of time here, so.
Sorry, I didn't mean to go ahead too quickly. Again, and I think you can read this, and you can get a copy of this if you want, but obviously one of the goals of the collaborative process with Rick and I is to, and with our agency and with the police department, with the St. Louis Metropolitan Police Department, is to obviously, our focus from the victim advocacy standpoint is to reduce re-traumatizing the victim. We've seen direct ties to that immediate response to a victim of rape and sexual assault and the reduction in the rates of victims that go on to be diagnosed with post-traumatic stress disorder, which is obviously the same thing as shell shock, rape trauma syndrome. It's all the same thing with basically different causes, and that is definitely a key factor in whether or not someone will go on to function, move forward in their lives, feel at least like they're supported, whether or not there's a criminal justice outcome that's positive on how they were treated, how they felt the response went, how they felt if they were respected, if the process went well. And then obviously, as Rick said, it is something also when you have victims that feel comfortable telling exactly what happened as opposed to being ashamed or feeling judged or maybe changing, although they were raped, changing the circumstances around that out of fear of being judged or not helped, you're going to have more likelihood of a successful prosecution if you have victims that feel comfortable telling you exactly what happened, regardless of the circumstances. So again, collaboration is the key for us. And we're going to continue to answer the questions and go forward, but we just want to say thank you to everyone for the amazing work that you do. Our contact information is here. If we would be happy if you think of something, have a suggestion for us, information, questions, anything, feel free and contact us at any time. And we're going to kind of stick around and do the questions.
So I had a question from one of the people out there, was that investigating cases only where there's a DNA hit. No, we're investigating other cases, or regarding seminal fluid. We are investigating cases with other evidence, and we're just picking up some cold because we see a pattern years later. Hair is a big thing that makes television. Hair for the FBI to do that sample, they require, I believe it's 45 hairs from your suspect to be able to confirm if the one hair at the scene matches his. That is almost near impossible, so I need to throw hair away. Another question was about only meeting with victims when their case can go forward. And Cindy and I have gone back and forth with this, and we couldn't come up with an answer, and that's how I was first introduced to Ilsa, was calling her up and saying, what do you think? We have these cases that we may be able to solve, but statute of limitations we can't prosecute. They're just, the facts of the case say, oh my goodness gracious, anyone that would read this would say, I don't know if we can go forward with this.
And Rick has asked me, and I've gone to our clinical staff, we've gone over this and over this. What we've kind of come to as a basic consensus with our clinical staff here and from the different places where Rick has gone, that we basically have to we can't make that decision for people. For some people, just to know who their perpetrator is, if the perpetrator is in prison, if they're not, to have some closure, they at least that way don't feel like they have to look over their shoulder for the rest of their life. Because for some victims, particularly obviously when there's a stranger rape or sexual assault, that is something that stays with them for the rest of their lives, especially as time goes on and they know they may not recognize that person or never got to look at that person. They feel like every time they walk out of their house and they go to the store or they turn around, they wonder, is that the man that did this? Is this the person that did this to me? Does he live in my neighborhood? Is he walking down the street across from me? So I think we just can't make an assumption that we should not contact people. I think we contact them and give them the option of how much information they want. I realize that can be detrimental to some people, but it's not something that I think Rick and I can take the responsibility for deciding for that person, and that's kind of what we've had the consensus we've had to kind of come to with that.
So another question came up about child sexual cases that were never reported, and they're coming forward now. I can tell you that Cindy and I have an open environment where she can call me and say, hey, Rick, I have a client, and I always know when I'm talking to the social workers because they refer to clients, and police are going to say I have a victim, so it's a whole different take on it. But that is interested in coming forward. Could you meet with them? These are the years. Is there any expectation? And my thing is always, hey, I'm not an expert on statute of limitations. The prosecuting attorney is. So come on in, talk to me. I will write up the report, and we will take it to the attorneys who will decide. And what Cindy and I have found is that my act of listening to them and validating the complaint, sometimes they never even thought that would happen. That somebody getting prosecuted was far off, but just the validation of the allegation and Cindy, briefly, would you agree with that?
Yeah, absolutely. And for some victims, they feel like they feel responsible. It's different reasons. A, feel like they need to tell it. They just feel they need to tell law enforcement, at least have that documented, what happened is the way they'll think of it. And also they feel like in some ways a lot of victims of child sexual abuse feel shame because they didn't come forward and they fear there's been other victims. So they feel by telling Rick what happened, even if they know going into it that there's a good chance, and I'll be honest with them, I'll tell them I can't. And this is something that advocates really need to be aware of. Don't get out your manual and look at your statute of limitations because it does not always apply. There can be some very minute stipulations in the laws, and we've had cases with cold hit DNA cases that wouldn't have gone forward if not for some small piece that a prosecutor was able to say, well, I think that would fit into this, and this may negate that particular statute of limitations. The absolute most effective thing I can do, if the victim is willing to do that and comfortable, I can initiate a phone call without giving the victim's information, just talk to Rick and ask him for clarification. If it's something that's not extraordinarily clear, then I'll offer the option, would you like to meet with the detective and sit down and talk with him? They know going into it that there may or may not be a legal justice for them or criminal justice, a positive outcome, and they're being informed, but they're having that option to come in. And when you have someone like Rick who responds in that way, and I'm there with them as support, that team effect, that collaborative process, it is usually a beneficial and positive thing for them at that point, as much as it can be.
So there's some other chat going on about statute of limitations, and that's state by state. And I suggest that you let the prosecuting attorney do that, because just as Cindy talked about with that. And as for federally prosecuting a rape, I have yet to be able to do it. The feds will pick up some kidnappings, a large amount of human trafficking, if you can make it a human trafficking case. But for a state-level forcible rape, at least here with our U.S. Attorney's Office, they say they don't have a federal nexus for that. So that's out. Another question came in about the DNA samples and on the boyfriend samples and the confirmation samples. When it comes to DNA questions on alleles and the percentage of the matches, I cannot really answer that. Your local lab would have to do that. But I can tell you that if they send me the hit, my lab is saying, hey, we have enough to say that we're willing to go into court and do this. I don't know if there are other things from my lab where they're not notifying me if they don't match. I think they are notifying me, but we went over it, and it came up again, so it's a very important question. But when you can't file a case for statute of limitations, contact the victim or not. And Ilsa and I had a 45-minute conversation several times about it. Cindy and I have talked. Our answer is yes, that you contact them and let them know that, yeah, go ahead, Cindy.
And then let them know, let them kind of make the step or the decision of how much information they want. We're not going to insist on meeting with them and going over every bit of information and telling them this. If they don't want to really go forward, it might be a phone conversation, then I'm following up with them and still connecting them. Obviously, our services, my services as far as counseling services, connecting them with counseling or support, advocacy, are not contingent in any way, shape, or form on whether or not they choose to go forward with the criminal justice process. That's something that they automatically just because.
And finally, a question, and I'll name her because this is the million-dollar question Cindy and I get asked. And Alicia wanted to know, how does she, where she's at, get law enforcement, Cindy's already laughing, to see the benefit and advantages of using advocates in the process with the victim? Alicia, my question or my answer to you is, you got to go to the chief of police. Because I could give you 100 feel-good reasons for why I believe this is good. And I can talk to every other detective in my office about why this is the right way to do it. But when it all boils down to, if the chief says you're going to do something, policemen are like chameleons, and we can change any color and do just about anything that we need in order to get the job done. And in my department, it was something that we were working on, and then it was taken to the chief, and he said, yeah, I want this to be the policy. And so for every new detective that's come into the office, this is all that they know. But my recommendation is you get to the upper command staff, and the foot soldiers at the bottom will follow the rules.
Well, and I agree that can be very helpful if you have the opportunity to do that. I will also say there's other ways, too, I would recommend, because I get asked that question a lot. Actually, every time Rick and I present, I'll have advocates come up to me afterwards and say, but how do I get that? How do I get law enforcement on board? I honestly think there's several different routes. What Rick talked about is probably extremely effective and the most time-effective way to do it, but that just doesn't always work. I think that one of the things you can do is reach out. Usually in most of the jurisdictions we work with the most, even if it's not St. Louis City, half of my clients come from other jurisdictions. I know one detective or one officer that we've been able to work together in the past, and I'll count on that person. I'll contact that person if, say, it's child sexual abuse and the person has questions about statute of limitations. I will go directly to that individual and try to, slowly kind of work to integrate and have a working relationship with some of the other officers in that unit. Hopefully with one person having a very good experience with advocacy, that'll grow. The other thing Rick and I have done, I've actually commandeered him to do regularly, is I coordinate and plan trainings that are specific to law enforcement, where I bring on not just pushing, well, I don't want to say pushing, that's a bad, but really trying to elaborate don't listen to him, elaborate on the benefits of the collaborative response, but also have other specialists come in to offer additional training and in-depth training on different issues relevant to investigating sexual assault. We've done that for the last 3 years. We've had conferences, and the last conference we had was a day-long conference. It's a lot of work, and it takes a lot of effort, but from that, we had 3 different jurisdictions come up to us and ask, how do we form, just by hearing Rick and I do a 2-hour piece on how we collaborate, not just with cold hit DNA cases, but with all sexual assault cases that we work with, and how that process works and the effectiveness of that. We ended up having multiple jurisdictions come on and basically ask, how do we do this? How do we set this up? And that was a group of detectives that had come to the training. They connected me directly with their lieutenant, and they connected our staff directly with their lieutenant, and that's kind of formulated a partnership. So there's other ways to go about it. And in all honesty, you have our contact information. If you want to talk about any of this further, please feel free and give me a call or email, and I'd definitely be happy to elaborate on that. And someone asked about confidentiality. That's a Missouri state statute that allows confidentiality for advocates, sexual assault victim advocates. For years we'd had confidentiality in the state of Missouri for domestic violence advocates, but in 2008, I believe it was November of 2000, maybe August of 2008, a law was passed that allowed that same confidentiality for victim advocates. So we're not considered, Rick loves this term, we're not considered competent.
The law says they will be found incompetent.
Which we actually love that, because it basically means we're not called into court to testify. So we're able to just be there, be an emotional support to the victim. We don't take notes during the interview. I would never, ever recommend that from any victim. You sit there, you're an emotional support to that victim, and focus on how they're doing emotionally, anything you think that maybe something that they took wrong or having a difficult time processing, or just kind of sticking points for them, and then we work through the emotional end of that after they're finished with a detective.
And another question came up a little bit about DNA, and I'm getting out of my comfort zone, but what I do know is that in the state of Missouri, the largest single DNA database is with the Department of Corrections for convicted offenders. The second largest is the City of St. Louis's database. And our criteria is rather large because we have victim standards in there. We have the police in there. We have arrestees. We have suspects. We have unknowns. So it is very large. But getting your sample to go to the next level is what requires some stringent cut down. And may there be samples that are contained in the City of St. Louis that might not be up at the national level? I think that is the case. And so what I do when I've tracked a suspect to a certain area, or I believe he lived somewhere prior, I get a hold of that local department and find out what my lab can send them to get them to do an individual check on that, to say, if this guy was living here at this time, do you have anything for that? All of our unknowns are uploaded, so if we're going to get a forensic hit, all of our unsolved rapes are out there floating around. What may not be out there is the guy that worked at the gas station that we swabbed because he was a victim's boyfriend. Now that sample, that's what the FBI is saying. We don't want that sample encoded. That person doesn't meet the requirements to be up at the national level, but you can keep him there at your local level, and if we need to, we can always get that sample. So, I did. My question comes in about informing victims prior to the confirmation. I got to go, when I get this person that's named in an unknown rape case, I have to go out to see if that is the guy, whether that's going to be in a photo lineup, a physical ID, something along that lines, or sometimes just asking the name. hey, do you know anyone named Joe? And seeing that. So I have to figure out, I get with the victim before I go get a confirmation DNA, because a lot of times my suspects are in Minnesota, they're in Texas, they're in California, and they have to fly me out there, or they're even in a prison in Missouri where it's a 3 or 4 hour drive. So when I get a DNA hit, after reviewing the original report, the next step is to meet with the victim and see if they know that person. Because I don't want to say it's 50-50, but in a good number of, I go out there and they say, oh no, that was my boyfriend back then. And then we have to come back and backtrack and have the lab remove that sample from the FBI, and it becomes more complex. And that's why nowadays there's stringent guidelines on uploading samples. So any other questions? I think that I think, Andrew, we answered your question, so anyone else?
Hi, Rick. It's Ilsa. I think that we have to sign off here in a minute. I want to thank you very much. I just want to actually add something real quick about the statute of limitations issue, and I've appreciated our conversations about this. This is a really humongous issue, I think, and a big issue for me, and I learned a lot from our focus group that we had with the 11 survivors. Several of them were from the Dallas area that has a cold case unit that specifically actually focused on cases that were past the statute of limitations. And what we found through that is that the victims in those cases were very pleased to have some answers in those cases about who the offender was. These were stranger rape cases, but who the offender was. But also, one of them recently had an opportunity to provide an impact statement in a case against the perpetrator. It was a different case. He was actually being tried on a case of some sexual exploitation of a child. But that survivor, the adult survivor, was able to go in and give an impact statement in that case. And that was a really creative way for her to find a little bit of justice, a little bit of her day in court, so to speak. I had several survivors say various forms of, the process kind of is more important than the outcome. So, I think a lot of what Cindy and Rick talked about is how you are treating victims along the way, and that, you do the best you can do, but you can't necessarily protect victims from the truth. And so I think in these cases what I've learned is that, we have to believe that victims are resourceful and we can help them through this process, even if we can't find necessarily justice in the way that we all sort of think of justice. As perpetrator goes to jail and that's kind of the end of it. There's other ways to find justice. Yeah.
Can I interrupt you? A lot of people are leaving quickly. You are going to put this on the website and it's recorded, correct?
Yes, it is recorded. That's my next thing I wanted to say. The webinar is recorded. It will be available on our website along with the PowerPoints. I want to thank you both for your time today. I want to thank our funder, the Office on Violence Against Women. And if you have any further questions or need technical assistance, please feel free to contact me or Cindy and Rick. I'm sure we'll be able to answer or help you in the best that we can. So thank you for listening and have a great afternoon.
Thank you.
Thanks.